Reverse the Trend is somewhat of a new organization, as it's a network that was created only a little over a year ago. Its goal is really to bring together young people from all over the world to really raise awareness and educate youth on the twin existential threats that are nuclear weapons and climate change. And we thought it was a particularly fitting time to organize such a conference as this past Earth Day. And we truly believe that and the environmental effects of nuclear weapons are a subject that is too often swept under the rug. So now is the time to shed some light. Before we start, I do want to acknowledge our esteemed sponsors that are here, that are the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and SPE, Sciences Po Environment at Sciences Po Paris in the Reims campus. Thank you to both organizations for your hard work and for helping us in organizing and facilitating this event. And I also want to thank our esteemed speakers. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate to this event today. So today we will hear from Dr. Benoit Pelopidas, who is the director of the Nuclear Knowledges Program at Sciences Po Paris. We'll hear from Veronique Christory of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Jean-Marie Collin from ICAN France. We'll hear from Dr. Ivana and Hughes from the K1 Center for Nuclear Studies at Columbia University, and also from Marc Finaud from the Geneva Center for Peace and Security. And before we start, I'm gonna pass the floor to Christian Ciobanu, who is the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and one of the original creators of Reverse the Trend. Christian.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. I would like to echo your sentiments about Reverse the Trend. RTT's motto is that youth must rise up and take action. And we're very proud of RTT Francophone and our other chapters. We have chapters throughout the world which are working directly with youth campaigners. And just to clarify, we are a youth network. We're also very grateful that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, which is committed to a world free of nuclear weapons, serves as the fiscal sponsor of our youth network. NAPF is also serving, and this is why Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is co-sponsoring this event, as a consultant to the co-facilitators of the Positive Obligations, Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW, namely Kiribati and Kazakhstan. Now turning to today's event. This event is very timely because the first meeting of states parties will occur in June of 2022. Leading up to the first MSP, state parties and civil society have been discussing the implementations of the positive obligations. A series of informal consultations have been held already between state parties and civil society. In connection to these discussions, RTT has been hosting a series of events about victims, assistance, and environmental remediation. Yesterday, we convened an event with PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Climate Cardinals, and the Marshallese Education Initiative. Today, we are organizing this Zoom conference with another set of esteemed NGOs and well-respected experts in the field. I am looking forward to the presentations, and now I would like to give the floor back to Mathilde. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. So without further ado, I will now give the floor over to Dr. Benoit Pelopidas, who is the founding director of the Nuclear Knowledges Program at Sciences Po Paris. He will kick us off with some thoughts on the environmental effects of nuclear weapons and the intersectionality of the fights against climate change and nuclear weapons. Benoit, thank you.
Thanks, Mathilde. Thanks, Mathilde. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good whichever part of the day is relevant to you. So I'm Benoit, and I'm gonna tell you a few things. I'm gonna actually tell you 3 things to set the floor for the panelists that are going to follow me in the 10 minutes that follow. Essentially, those are the 3 points. I'm going to give them to you in a summary. So first point is simply, there is more than one way civilizations can end. And by missing the interlinkages between those points, we may speed up the moment when this happens. Second, existing scholarship in policy analysis does not adequately take those interlinkages seriously. Third, in nuclear policy analysis, as the current plan is to keep nuclear weapons for another 70 years without any unwanted nuclear explosions, this is a time horizon in which catastrophic climate change has to be incorporated, whatever our preferences regarding nuclear weapons policies are. So if you hate me, you've heard everything, and I could stop now. If you don't mind, I'll elaborate just a bit on each of those 3 points. So first point, more than one way civilizations can end. By missing those many ways and not addressing their intricate effects, we may produce and speed up the ending we want to delay and possibly avoid. This is a lesson that the bear learned too late in La Fontaine's fable, L'ours et l'amateur des jardins, or the bear, and oftenly translated wrongly, the gardener or the garden's lover. So I will simply read to you the last verses. So it's a story about a bear and a gardener who essentially meet, connect, and engage with kind of mutual support. And so, as Brune never spoke 2 words a day, the man in silence worked away. Brune, for hunting, had acquired some fame, and every night brought home a store of game. He also gave to flies successful chase, focus on the flies, and kept them from his sleeping neighbor's face. That's the key mission for the bear. One day, his friend was in profound repose when one of these sat sporting on his nose. Brune in vain to chase him tried. I'll have thee somehow or somewhere, he cried. He said, and seized a stone, which straight he threw against the fly and broke his neighbor's skull. A clever marksman, but in logic, dull. He crushed the fly and killed his neighbor too. Better a foe, if wisdom be his lot, than make a friend of such a stupid sort. That was La Fontaine. You see, the bear thought the gardener's problem was the flies, and the flies only. He was committed to solving the flies problem at any cost. Therefore, in order to solve it, he proceeded to kill his friend, the gardener. We have a duty to do better and not commit to solve the nuclear weapons problem alone or the climate change problem alone without thinking about how solving this one may aggravate the other one and get us or some of us killed in the process. The good news is, if you want to be in a good mood, you could say only a 17th century bear could make such a mistake. I don't really think that's a fair assessment, but let's keep that in mind. We have a need to think through the different ways nuclear weapons and climate change are 2 existential threats which interact with each other. So the second point is that existing scholarship and policy discourse are not seriously thinking about this interrelation. They each focus on their preferred ways civilizations end and assume that they are the only ones. Nuclear weapons policy analysts most often focus on World War III or escalation to nuclear war, but their imagined future planet is today's planet. They don't take the prospect of deep deterioration seriously. Similarly, climate change analysts, or at least most of them, or most of the ones I read, write and think in a nuclear weapon-free world. To the point that 2 prominent ones have recently said that the existential threat of the Cold War was nuclear war. Now it is climate change. No, it is both, at least, and maybe more, because here we're only talking about climate change. One could add catastrophic collapse of biodiversity in other planetary boundaries. As the speakers around this virtual table know very well, nuclear weapons have not gone away, and their destructive capacity remains far beyond civilization-ending levels. So in all fairness, there is a rising discussion that connects the two, but it's a discussion of the consequences of climate change for security policy. The missing discussion flips the direction of the arrow. The missing discussion is on the consequences of security policies on climate change in planetary boundaries. So not just nuclear weapons, but global arms racing. This takes me to my third and final point, which is we need a reminder that we know we're facing at least one major enemy in the next 70 years, which cannot be deterred with nuclear weapons. His name is catastrophic climate change and biodiversity collapse. This is important because claiming success of nuclear weapons policy, here I'm putting myself in the shoes of the bear again, assumes that the country that declares success is still inhabitable. If this is correct, we know the imagined future on which nuclear weapons policies are being made and publicly justified today, an imagined future in which catastrophic climate change doesn't happen, is the one imagined future that we know will not happen. Therefore, for this reason, I understand the interventions of my colleagues on this panel as attempts at correcting the mistake of isolating the nuclear weapons issues from rapid degradations of planet Earth due to climate change. And since I had the privilege of speaking first, I hope those few words did set the stage for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. And you made excellent points. We do truly need to realize that our movements intersect and we are stronger together. That is exactly the message that we want to pass today. So we're now turning to Veronique Christory, who is the Senior Arms Control Advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross delegation to the United Nations. She will quickly touch upon the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, as they are, let's say, the other side of the same coin when it comes to nuclear weapons. And to introduce her intervention, we will now play a quick video from the ICRC, which depicts the reality we would face in the event of a nuclear attack. I don't think we can hear Emile.
Sorry about that. I think it should be good now.
In the first second, the white light is blinding, the heat immense. In the first day, fires consume the city and there's no way to fight them. Your skin is badly charred. In the first week, those hospitals that are still functioning are overwhelmed and can't treat the injured. Others who seem fine suddenly fall ill and die from radiation sickness. In the first year, radiation has seeped into the water and the soil. Crops and animals are contaminated. In 10 years, congratulations. You might not have leukemia or another cancer, but many of your friends do. You fear it will come any day. In 30 years, you look at your children wondering if you've passed on the effects of radiation. In 70 years, you're still seeing your doctor for checkups. He says it's a miracle you're still alive. The humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons are horrific and span generations. It's time to ban them now.
Veronique, please, the floor.
One single scientist create.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, all. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you, and thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to mention that the video was done before the negotiation and the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So now nuclear weapons are banned, but I think that the video is an excellent way to show in a 1.5 minute the impact of nuclear weapons. As I said, thank you very much for the invitation. And I think that everything is said in the title. Nuclear weapons are threatening the survival of the planet and of the humankind. And it's urgent to reverse the trend. So I'm happy to be here to discuss it with you all. As you may know, the ICRC is one of the largest humanitarian organizations. Our mandate is to help and protect people affected by armed conflict and violence. And we are also the guardian of international humanitarian law. Switzerland is the depository state of IHL, or the Geneva Convention, as we call them. And we contribute to develop this important body of laws. So in the last 25 years, I have been the immense privilege to be part of developing treaties and law from the prohibition of landmines to cluster munition, negotiating the Arms Trade Treaty, and recently the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I would like to begin to read 4 sentences of the first telegram that was sent by the ICRC after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, when there was no TV, no social media. A piece, I think that it's very important, it's a piece of archive in the horrifying history of humanity, and to discuss the impact of nuclear weapon. I think that we need perhaps to reconnect of what it means. So I quote, "Thousands of people in the street died like flies. We witnessed a sight totally unlike anything we have ever seen before. The center of the city was a sort of white patch, flattened and smooth like the palm of an hand. The slightest trace of houses seems to have disappeared. Every living thing was petrified in an attitude of acute pain." Unquote. I gave the copy of this integral telegram to a delegation of Hibakusha, atomic survivor of the atomic bombing, when they came to New York in 2015 to deliver a petition with millions of signatures to call on the ban of nuclear weapons. It was a very poignant moment because many of them, they said that in this telegram, it's embodied everything they lived through when they were kids. And the ICRC witnessed firsthand the apocalyptic impact of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And that is also an important element because the ICRC has always been calling on the prohibition of nuclear weapons since September 1945. We did the first call, and also that we are always speaking of prohibiting or regulating weapons that we witness firsthand in our work. So it's not an abstract or theory. It's really what we witness when we are in a context with an armed conflict. To give you an example, and I think that it's also important to stress this aspect, is that 80% of the doctors and 90% of the nurses were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ICRC with the Japanese Red Cross organized the assistance of the victim with almost nothing. Today, more than 75 years later, Japanese Red Cross are still treating patients from the radiation. And I had the opportunity to go to go in Japan and to visit Red Cross hospital in Japan, and it's really honestly mind-boggling to see department on oncology treating patients from World War II, and also second and third generation of patients that they have cancer emanating from the radiation of World War II. So my first point is that we cannot allow a repetition of this dark past. Nuclear weapons threaten irreversible harm to the environment and to the future generation. They threaten the very survival of humanity, as Benoit already said. And we know that the nuclear explosion could have insurmountable challenges to humanitarian action and assistance, and no states or humanitarian organization is prepared to the enormous need that a nuclear explosion will create. And that is very important. The ICRC conducted a study a couple of years ago, and we interviewed the UN, states, and everybody said that they will not be able to cope with an emergency and with a use of nuclear weapon. It will take even perhaps weeks to even enter the zone after the use of nuclear weapon. So what we cannot prepare for, what we cannot respond to, we must prevent. And I think that is one of the very important message. And I also wanted to mention that last month, in the midst of the war in Ukraine, the ICRC called on states to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again. The introduction of nuclear weapons renders armed conflict significantly more dangerous and risks a global conflagration in which humanity will suffer irreparably. This is really a wake-up call and a call of utmost caution. My second point is that there is a beacon of hope. The entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in January 2021 sent a powerful message. The use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. Nuclear weapons are acceptable as a means of warfare, unacceptable from a moral, humanitarian, and now also legal perspective. The preamble of the treaty notes that any use of nuclear weapon will be contrary to international humanitarian law. It will be also abhorrent to the principle of humanity and the dictate of public conscience. And that they are very strong words. I think that it's very rare that in the treaty we go to the term of the public conscience, and the ICRC pushed very hard during the negotiation of the treaty to put this aspect. The treaty recognizes the effort of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, the UN, Ibakusha, the civil society, religious leader, and academic in this banned treaty. And that is very important because it was a comprehensive and collective effort, and we all have a role to play. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons became the first instrument to help mitigate the catastrophic humanitarian consequence of nuclear weapons, notably by requiring states to help victims of nuclear testing and use and clearing contaminated areas. And that it's a very important aspect of the treaty. It's the assistance to victims and the environmental remediation, and that's why it's really a humanitarian treaty. The other thing that it's important to mention is that the TPNW recognized the equal, full, and effective participation of both women and men as essential for the promotion and attainment of sustainable peace and security, including the effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament. And it's a point that it's very important also at the personal level, because when I began like 25 years ago at UNIDIR, we were very few women in the room, and now there are more and more women, but I really engage women to be at the table of the negotiation on the discussion on nuclear disarmament. I think that it's really key. I also would like to say that I participate in the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and honestly, I don't think that the treaty would have been adopted without the involvement of so many women. Head of delegation, the chair of the conference was Ambassador White of Costa Rica. The High Representative of the UN, Mrs. Izumi Nakamitsu, she put also a lot of weight in the negotiation, as well as Beatrice Finn from ICAN. She really pushed hard, and all the team of ICAN, but they really push hard on states to negotiate this treaty. Numerous women, Ibakusha, were present, and many delegation ambassadors were women from South Africa, Nigeria, Switzerland, Sweden, and I think that it made and Ireland made a huge contribution to have many women around the table. And that is also important because I think that we also push very hard to acknowledge the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women's health, and notably on to provide gender-sensitive victim assistance, and that it's a very important aspect. And so we really encourage now states to promptly sign and ratify the treaty. I will go to my third point. There is hope, but we need your engagement. We need the engagement of the younger generation. As you will hear from other speakers, research is crucial. Research into humanitarian impact of nuclear use and testing is necessary to inform our understanding of the unique characteristic of this weapon and the catastrophic impact of their use. We need more research and awareness to defend and support the rights of individual and communities affected by nuclear weapon and nuclear testing. We need to provide a crucial basis for humanitarian preparedness, to engage in more risk education. And there is also a need to scale up effort to research and understand the effect of ionizing radiation on reproductive health. And there are very few studies, except perhaps the very good research of Mary Olson. But there will need much more research on this issue. Pending the elimination, all states, in particular the nuclear weapon states and nuclear allied states, must take immediate steps to reduce the risk of intentional or accidental use of nuclear weapons, and I think that it's more urgent now than ever. In June, as you may know, the first meeting of states of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will take place in Vienna. And in August, there will be the Non-Proliferation Review Conference. And these two conferences will provide key opportunity, but also test for states to make tangible progress toward achieving nuclear disarmament. And nuclear disarmament is a legal obligation of the international community as a whole. Even states they're not party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But as you may know, the Article 6 of the NPT call on state to go to general nuclear disarmament. And then, so you will see the ICRC will be very active and will be at the forefront of this engagement. As students and future leaders, you have a key role to play in raising awareness, advocacy, research, shaping policy and decision making. And your participation as a younger generation in the MSP1 and the NPT review conference should be encouraged. I mean, and I would be very happy to stay engaged with you. To conclude, the only way to guarantee that nuclear weapons are never used again is by prohibiting and eliminating them. we need your engagement, creativity, and leadership. And I think that we also need your creativity. We need to think out of the box to find solution. Seldom collective action to free the world of the dark shadow of nuclear weapons have been more urgent, and so I'm very happy to be with you, and let's work together to contribute to this achievement. Thank you very much. And I would like also, on a personal note, let's say that I am very delighted to be with Benoit Pelopidas and Marc, Finaud, and Ivana and Jean-Marie Collin. I have a lot of respect and admiration for all of you. So I am really delighted to be with you and Christian, that my long-standing friend and collaborator and partner in crime on all this discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronique, for your intervention and reminding us that we're truly not prepared if in the case of a nuclear attack. And to put everything we have heard right now into a more tangible context, we will now go to Jean-Marie Collin, who is the spokesman of ICAN France and an expert in nuclear disarmament and deterrence. And he will go over the environmental effects faced by Algeria after the French nuclear test in the Sahara in the 1960s. Jean-Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, Veronique, for your words, and Christian and Mathilde for organizing this event. I'm going to share my screen. If I can, yes, normally. Yep. It's going to be easier like that. Sorry. I think you see it correctly now. Well,
yes.
Okay. Okay. So more than ever, the clock is ticking with all the recent developments since the last of the 24th of February. And the fact that not only Putin, but across the world, more and more advisors, politicians, researchers begin to think openly that the use or even the necessity of using a nuclear weapons will be acceptable in this actual war is an offense to all the people who have died of the bomb and all to all the survivors of this weapon of massive destructions. When we think of nuclear testing, it may seem as an obsolete practice of a foregone era, an aberration we left behind in the past centuries, but the nuclear consequences here, in the case that I'm going to present, Algeria, are still here. And this is why we cannot and should not close the chapter of nuclear testing. And furthermore, as Veronique presented quickly, the TPNW, so the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, contain positive obligations, notably Article 6, Victim Assistance and Environmental Remediations, and Article 7, International Cooperations and Assistance. So all of these points are really important to understand how the case of the French nuclear test in Algeria can go on the positive way. As I will present, it's a bit complicated. So I will begin with a state of play first. As France carried around 210 nuclear atmospherics and underground tests in the Algerian Sahara and in Polynesia between 1960 to 1996. So it's the third largest numbers of tests carried out after USA and USSR. Exactly 17 were realized in Algerian part of the Sahara Desert between 1960 to 1996. And after 1962, which was the Evian Accord, which opened the road to the independence of Algeria. So it means that the majority of the tests, 11 exactly, were realized in an independent country. And it's really an important point to remember and to understand why it took so much time for negotiations and just some talks between the two countries. Globally, we can think, or because we don't have the exact figures, that around 150,000 soldiers participate to the experience, to the global experience, so to the test in Sahara and in Polynesia. And probably around 24,000 soldiers were in the Sahara. And we should try to imagine that when the French arrived in 1966, 1957, everything had to be built in the desert because it was the desert. Obviously, desert doesn't mean that there were nothing. There is a nice environment, there is some people, but there was nothing about test seats. There is nothing, no roads, no military camp. So they have to build everything of this kind of tools, and they even built some swimming pool for the soldiers. And now this is what still are in the Sahara. So you can see some monuments to remember what happened. So behind is the Tanefala Mountains, where some nuclear underground tests were realized. And here you have another part of these monuments who is there to really remember what happened in the past. So on the 17 nuclear explosions, some experience works, some others not. And I think particularly to the underground explosion codenamed Beryl in 1962, which we are going to celebrate or to commemorate the 50th anniversary, the 1st of May. Originally, this test should be underground, but it failed and it opened the mountains. As you can see here, a huge fallout get out of the mountain and contaminate a large part of the south of Sahara. And until 1990, the silence remained on what happens on these zones. The French government always denied the accidents, and there were some others. And the effect on the environment and the fact that some fallout affected the European continent, notably Spain, Italy. But there were also some fallout went until the north of Sweden. So even if today we have a better knowledge of nuclear tests, accidents, and their consequences, there is still a lack of key information as to the existence of a large quantities of nuclear and non-nuclear waste to ensure the safety of populations and environmental remediations. And I'm going to speak about the waste. I wrote 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, a study named Radioactivity Under the Sand, the Waste from French Nuclear Tests in Algeria. I wrote that with a colleague of the Observatory of the Armament. And when we begin to work on that question, we knew that it was like kind of in the public domain that everybody knows that the French let some nuclear waste. What we didn't have is that the proof, is the documents. And we were super happy to work inside France because France have a real big administrations. And we find these notes who really explain that this person's name, Mr. Chivo, contaminated a screwdriver and was in the obligations to bury it in the sand. So they have the obligation to buy another one. And like that, we have the proof that since the beginning of the test in Sahara, France set up a policy of burning all the waste in the sand. And the desert was seen as an ocean. And it also explained that what happened in the Pacific, in Moria and Fangatofa. If the desert was seen as an ocean, obviously the ocean in the Pacific is an ocean, and that's the reason why they dump a minimum of almost 3,000 tons of nuclear waste in the deep sea. And to come back in the Sahara, so that the study we realize, we class the waste into 3 categories. The non-radioactive waste related to the French occupations, so it's like to the dismantle of the seats and to the presence of Algerians army since 1966. So the majority of this waste come from the destructions of the seats when the soldiers remove the camp. The second category is the contaminated material deliberately buried in the sand. So it's like I explained the screwdriver, but it's also like these planes named Vautour, where we find some pictures and notes that explains why they decide to bury these planes. And so, as you can see, they create some very used trench. They cut the planes in different parts and they put them inside. And as we suppose, because we have no information for the moment, these planes are still inside the desert and waiting to be removed as they are a waste, radioactive waste. But the most important and the most complicated waste is the radioactive materials emitted by nuclear explosions. That one would be probably impossible to remove as it's composed with lava, rocks, and sands. If I'm back to the Beryl accidents that I explained, that took place in 1st May in 1962. A lot of place around this mountain was completely polluted by the radioactivity and by the detonation of the bomb. So this zone has a high level of radioactivity, and for example, represents minimum a surface area of around 2.5 hectares. And so that's the reality of the actuality of the Sahara and the problematic of the nuclear waste. And in France, we have a law now, which is called the Morin Law. It was passed in the 5 January 2010. And this law focus only on the question of the health and not on the questions of the environment. And that explains also why nothing was really realized in direction of the Sahara and in direction of Polynesia. I'm going to be a little quicker, as I see my time is almost done. But what is important to see also is that there is a lot of new developments, and which is so that we can go and arrive to remove this waste. There is 2 huge developments in Algeria. So after we published our studies, there were some official meetings between the chief of staff of the Algerian and French army who openly speak about the remediations of the former nuclear test site. But the most important is that the creation in May 2021 of this National Agency for the Rehabilitations of the former French nuclear test. That's the beginning. That's one of the main points that was missed inside the Algerian authorities. As you know, the TPNW, and as I explained, there were 2 positive obligations, Article 6 and 7. With this agency, Algeria will be able to fulfill its obligations of this Article 6 and 7. So we really hope that it's the last steps before Algeria is going to the ratification process. And in France, there is also a lot of new developments. After, again, we published the studies, so in September 2020, our recommendations were taken by the person on the left of the screen, so with the blue shirt, it's Benjamin Stora, an historian. The President Macron ordered him like a few months before a study about the colonizations and the Algerian war. And Benjamin Stora decided, after we contact him, to take some of our recommendations. So that means the president and the whole staff of the president were aware about also of this problematic. And there were some official diplomatic meetings between France and Algeria, where for the first time it was revealed that they spoke together about how to organize some remediations and protection of the environment. So there is a lot of new developments. Obviously, it's like I will say, a step-by-step process. So it took a little bit of time, but since 3 years, these questions of the nuclear waste are really on the floor, and it's probably the reason. It's probably because the TPNW exists. Thank you for your attention. I will be happy to answer to your questions. And the studies is published in French, English, and in Arabic. I will put the link if it's not realized before. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. So we will now turn to Dr. Ivana Hughes. She is the director of the K1 Project, Center for Nuclear Studies, director of Frontiers of Science, and a senior lecturer in discipline in the Department of Chemistry at Columbia University. And she will tell us more about the situation faced by the Pacific. Ivana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mathilde and Christian and everyone. It's really an honor to be here with this group, and especially with this group of distinguished speakers. I'm always really touched. I've seen the video that Veronique has shown before, and I'm always literally on the verge of tears just watching it. This work is so important, and I greatly appreciate the passion that everyone brings to the topic. So I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about some, let's see, slideshow. Yes, that's good. Tell you a little bit about environmental impacts of the United States nuclear testing that was conducted in the Marshall Islands. And I'll just say my talk today will focus on the Marshall Islands. And of course, we just heard about the impacts of the testing in Algeria. We actually have a group. It's going to be me and Professor Emily Hughes from Columbia and 15 students going to French Polynesia in just a little over 3 weeks from now. So I hope to come back at some point and report back on what we have learned there. So I also want to connect to the points that Benoit made about the parallels and the importance of thinking about both climate change and nuclear weapons, and to not think of them as two separate issues, but to think of them in interconnected ways. There's so many ways in which you can think of the connection between the two topics, and not just merely by each of them being a threat to humanity. But I just want, for the purpose of this talk, make 2 points. The first point is really a quote from Tony de Bruym, who was one of the leaders of the Marshall Islands, a former foreign minister. He played an instrumental role in the Paris agreement on climate change. At the time, he was the ambassador for climate change for the Marshall Islands. And he was really, he really fought for decades, for years, both towards a world free of nuclear weapons and a world that awakens to the dangers of climate change. And when he talked about the two topics, he saw them as very much related, and he saw that they were happening in the Marshall Islands and the way that they were both affecting the Marshallese people. And I'll just quote him: "This is both are something that is happening to us, that is not of our own making, and for which there's a solution." And I think all of those points are really important to keep in mind when we're talking about also who will bear the brunt of the impacts and the effects that both of these challenges pose to humanity. I also want to make a separate point, which is back to the fact that we're thinking about this on Earth Day. Ultimately, in both cases, solid Earth, or planet Earth, will be just fine. It's us, it's humans, it's ecosystems. And when it comes to ecosystems, you may not be persuaded by ethical, moral arguments about other life on the planet, but even if you want to take a completely selfish, human-centered point, we rely on ecosystems for so much of what we have from our planet, whether it's the pollination of our crops, whether it's water filtration by different species, whether it's disease buffering, storm buffering, disease prevention. So many of the things that we get from our planet, we get because we have healthy and well-functioning ecosystems. Climate change and nuclear weapons threaten not just humanity, but our healthy ecosystems, and therefore it's back to us. The Earth will be fine. The Earth can handle radioactive isotopes. The Earth can handle higher temperatures, colder temperatures. It's our way of life. It's the fact that the changes when it comes, for example, to climate change will happen too fast for us to adjust. It's the fact that 40% of the population of humans lives within 100 kilometers of the coasts. And so what that means is that our way of life is predicated on changes not happening suddenly and not being catastrophic. So I'll just make that point and then tell you a little bit about the specifics of what happened in the Marshall Islands. It's an often quoted number: 67 nuclear tests over a period of 12 years immediately after. I mean, the plans were set essentially immediately after the horrendous attacks on Japan that we heard from Veronique about. And the testing went on for 12 years. What is often not pointed out is that these tests actually represent a relatively small number, about 7% of the total number of US nuclear tests. However, what happened and what I'm talking about here is that the vast majority of the really high energy yield nuclear tests, that means the tests that had the most power, the tests that brought forth the most fallout, the tests that were the most destructive, most of them, in fact, happened in the Marshall Islands. So one way to kind of see this is that over 55% of the total energy yield of all US nuclear tests was conducted, in fact, in the Marshall Islands during that relatively short period of time. So Marshall Islands, just for anyone who isn't just quite sure, isn't quite oriented, are located in the Pacific, just north of the equator, just west of the international date line. And then you can sort of think about kind of drawing a line from Australia to Hawaii, and just about halfway there, you'll find the Marshall Islands. And they are a collection of 29 coral atolls. And this map is a little bit misleading because what the coral atolls actually look like is like what you see in this photo that I took of Madura. That's the capital, and it's down here in the south. And of course, the shape and the sizes and so on differ among the atolls, but generally it's these thin strips of land, kind of, people also call them the pearls of the Pacific, as the smaller islands sort of form these, form lagoons, and again, have very little land in general. The 4 atolls that I have circled here in red are the ones that are considered most affected. That is not to say that other atolls weren't affected, but that these were sort of most dramatically affected. In particular, Bikini and Eniwetok are the 2 atolls where the testing was actually conducted, and Rongelap and Utrik are 2 atolls where people were living at the time of the test, and in particular, at the time of the Bravo test, which was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb used in the attack on Hiroshima. And so those people were exposed to enormous amounts of nuclear fallout. So we've made, since about 2015, we have traveled to the Marshall Islands numerous times and been on sort of 3 boat excursions to the Northern Marshall Islands and made a variety of measurements. I'm just, for the purpose of this talk, going to talk about 2 of the measurements, cesium-137 in the food and strontium-90 in ocean sediment. And I'll explain what I'm really talking about here is these radioactive isotopes that are produced in the bomb explosions and that can then have an adverse effect on humans. So again, going back to my initial point, if there's no life on Earth, if there's no life on Mars, and there's some cesium-137, there is really, essentially you could say there's no problem. Mars isn't going to care, right? But for us here on Earth, both we and other life on the planet do care if we're exposed to these isotopes. And here's why this matters. So cesium-137 chemically, so don't let the word scare you, because I know you can all get this, chemically behaves like potassium. You've all heard about potassium. You've all been told to eat bananas because they have potassium. Potassium, your body needs potassium. It needs it for things like for your muscles to be able to contract. It needs it for neurons in your brain to be able to communicate with one another. So it's a really important, and it's literally throughout your body. And if cesium-137 behaves like potassium, and you, for example, ingest food that has cesium-137, then that cesium-137 goes to the places where potassium would go, and therefore, when it then sort of releases radiation, you get exposed to it internally. Similarly, strontium-90 chemically behaves like calcium, and we all know that we need to either have dairy or you can eat broccoli and get your calcium. There are obviously other sources of calcium as well. And we have calcium in our bones, we have calcium in our teeth, but calcium turns out to also be involved in other bodily processes. So again, if there's strontium 90 in the environment, it's going to, and you ingest it, it's going to go into your body and sort of replace calcium and stay there. Both of these, exposure to both of these isotopes has been shown to lead to cancer. So cesium-137, really a variety of cancers, including brain cancer, and for strontium-90 in particular, because of the connection to bones and bone marrow, things like leukemia and cancer of the bone, some very rare types of cancers, but really, really devastating nevertheless. So this is just a kind of a couple of graphs just to give you a sense that we can really see cesium-137 in the fruits. So these are spectra. Again, doesn't matter, the specifics aren't important. These are spectra of fruits from Bikini and one from Utrecht. So Bikini is where the testing was conducted, Utrecht is farther away. And what we had found was that we really could see cesium-137 very clearly in fruits from Bikini, and that's shown here with this peak in the spectrum, and we did not see a similar peak in the fruits from Utrecht. And so what we ended up doing was really trying to figure out what concentrations of this cesium-137 were actually going to be okay if they're present in the food. And it turns out, as we started looking at the different standards that were out there, it turns out that the range of standards is really, really enormous. And so what you end up seeing, for example, these are standards set by the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, who set a specific standard for a variety of foods, whereas the FDA standard is either over or nearly 1,000 times, nearly either over or nearly 100 times greater. So it's a really wide range of values that are allowed according to different either countries or different entities. And so what we try to do is figure out, oops, sorry, let me remove this. We tried to figure out what was happening in the different islands with respect to these concentrations. And so we basically divided these limits from different countries, different organizations into colors and kind of tried to designate from green to red the different concentrations. And I'll just show you a map just for one island, Bikini Atoll, and see here, so yellow would be violating the limits set by Japan, but still being within limits set by the European Union. And then red would be violating even the limits set by the United States FDA. And what you see in Bikini is very few fruits, a couple of them don't violate the Japanese standard, but vast majority violate the Japanese standard. Some violate even the EU standard, and then several violate even the most permissive US FDA standard. I'll just show you one more thing, which is that we also measured strontium-90 in ocean sediment, not in the food yet, but we were really curious. This is an isotope that had received a lot of attention after the Chernobyl nuclear accident. And we were curious to see for ocean sediment where we had samples, what the sort of ratio was between cesium and strontium. And we found that strontium-90 in the ocean sediment was 5 to 10 times higher than cesium-137, which to us suggests that it is absolutely imperative at this point to figure out what the levels of strontium-90 are on land, in the food, etc. So it's just an example that really, despite in some sense decades of work, what is still missing is a full picture of the impact of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. And again, this is, the environment is important, but the environment is important precisely because it impacts humans and it impacts their health. And this is not in any way to indicate that the only impact from nuclear weapons testing is cancer rates. Of course, they have a much deeper, much greater impact on all aspects of human health, including mental health and social and emotional well-being. So I'll just close with saying that to me, this kind of work is really about two things. It's about righting a historical wrong. It's about justice. The Marshallese people often talk about nuclear justice, and they have not received it yet. And it's also for me about learning from history about the dangers of nuclear weapons, but also about the use of new technologies. I think at this moment, given that we're on day, 55 or so of the war in Ukraine, I think a lot of the world has woken up to the danger of nuclear weapons. And I think this is really precisely the moment in which we cannot give up this fight. And we have to not only strive towards a world free of nuclear weapons, but also one where the youth are engaged and are addressing the issue of climate change hand in hand. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ivana, for those very insightful remarks in the situation of the Marshall Islands. We clearly see the destructive effects of nuclear weapons. So now I guess it leaves us with the question of what we can do, and whether it be from our standpoint, from the government standpoint, and that is what now Marc Finaud will tell us about. So Marc, we're waiting for you.
Thanks very much, Mathilde. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. So I'll now share my few slides. And that's the advantage of speaking last, that you don't have to, you can speak faster. You don't have to repeat what others have said. Let me just try to see if I can change this view. Sorry on this. I know I have something to do. No, sorry. Okay, never mind. Let's, unless someone can tell me what to do, I'll share this sort of split screen. Okay, so I'll briefly talk and again repeat what others have said about the impact of nuclear weapons on the environment. Talk a little bit again about environmental remediation, the role of civil society, and see if we can have some takeaways. So again, I think it's been said by other speakers, it's difficult to separate the environment from people, from human victims, and so it's because we are both issues are intrinsically linked or interrelated. But it's good to also give some figures. We, of course, every year commemorate the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and honor the Hibakusha. But it's also important to also realize that there were victims after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there are actually still people being affected and dying because of nuclear weapons. Of course, the over 2,000 nuclear tests, and this prediction in the 90s by the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War that predicted about 2.4 million cancer deaths in the next decade or so. Then there were studies in the US about excess deaths from nuclear tests, of course. Lack of data from other nuclear countries, but we can have some rough estimates. Also, nuclear weapon production caused some victims, some diseases, some cancer deaths. And there's a 2016 study in the US, but again, not much transparency from other nuclear powers. And accidents, again, we of course know from research, from think tanks, about some of these so-called broken arrows or accidents that led to hundreds of fatalities and extensive radiation contamination. I recommend the famous study by Chatham House on this. So we know that the impact of a nuclear explosion depends on several factors. Of course, the yield, the power of the destructive power of the weapon, the type of the environment, and this is where we realize that nuclear testing was done sometimes in desert or atolls, which were either unpopulated or with small populations, but we know from Hiroshima and Nagasaki what nuclear weapons explosions can do in urban environment. And of course, depends also on the weather, the winds, because they can increase the fallout and the contamination in several regions. Here you have various, circles depending on, again, on the yield, like 100 kilotons can lead to damage up to 8 or 10 kilometers, but you can have other cases where contamination, as Jean-Marie said, for instance, was much broader. It covered the whole part of Europe in the case of Algeria. Now, the yield, of course, of weapons is very important. And when we compare with Hiroshima, 15 kilotons, or Nagasaki, 22 kilotons, now we are, the US sort of standard missile carries 455 kilotons. So you can imagine the difference in the destructive power. Russian missiles, 800 kilotons, and now the newest Sarmat Russian missiles that can carry up to 16 warheads is estimated to carry over 7,500 kilotons. That means the equivalent of 500 Hiroshimas. Now, we know from various studies also that radiation from nuclear weapons can harm the environment in many ways because of the contamination of water, soil, plants, animals, and the atmosphere. The animals, of course, can ingest contaminated water or plant and then affect the whole of the food chain. They can also fly away or migrate to other locations, expanding the impact of contamination. You can also have the impact of fires caused by nuclear explosions, producing smoke and soot, and that's part of the studies on potential nuclear winter that could lead to 2 billion victims of dying of famine. Now, environmental remediation has been mentioned as action to take as part of treaties. Now, it's interesting to note that the partial test ban treaty of 1963 hardly mentioned the environment. It was part of the preamble desiring to put an end to contamination of man's environment by radioactive substances, but there was nothing clearly specifically about remediation. The same with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, just noting the views expressed by member states that the treaty could contribute to the protection of the environment. So it was sort of very general recognition, but not followed up by specific measures. Now, it's different in the TPNW because, as Jean-Marie mentioned, there is a specific article dealing with environmental remediation, Article 6, which obliges each state party which has been contaminated to take necessary and appropriate measures. Not very specific, but the idea is to give states some flexibility to choose the measures for remediation. And these obligations, of course, are not prejudicing the other obligations of any other states, including non-state parties under international law about state responsibility or bilateral agreements for compensation or decontamination. And Article 7 actually also says that a state party, which means that a state party which had conducted nuclear explosions is legally obliged to provide assistance to the affected state parties. Now, there are a number of methods for environmental remediation, chemical, physical separation, solidification using cement or concrete, vitrification, containment. And as Ivana said, we have the example of the Marshall Islands, where there's been some efforts by the United States to use contamination, to use containment to prevent contamination and to include all the radioactive debris in this concrete dome, which took 3 years to complete. But there was this idea already early in the 80s that maybe it would not be completely effective and that it could be affected by wave or storm action. That was already anticipated, and this was confirmed more recently by a report from the Los Angeles Times that reported some leaks or risk associated with the rising sea level as a result of climate change. So this is another case where, as we know, nuclear weapons can have an impact on the environment, but climate change can also have an impact on nuclear weapons or their consequences. So what can civil society do apart from governments? Well, we have a number of cases where civil society mobilized itself and led to some international treaties like the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, then the demonstrations against deployment of Euromissiles in Europe that led to the INF Treaty, the demonstrations against French nuclear testing in the Pacific that led France to dismantle its test site and join the CTBT, and of course the mobilization by ICAN that led to the TPNW. So it's possible to mobilize itself, and there is another way to also include the potential consequences of nuclear weapons on the environment using the concept of ecocide or the crime of ecocide, which was defined by this coalition of NGOs as acts committed with knowledge that there is substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. And clearly we cannot ignore that such definition would certainly fit any use of nuclear weapons. So that's why there is this campaign to make it an international crime punished by the International Criminal Court, because it's a global issue and because most of the environment or the people suffering from this impact sometimes are, in other locations, in other countries, in different jurisdictions. So that's why we need this international crime. To conclude, I would just again repeat that this unacceptable impact of nuclear weapons on the environment has been demonstrated. And there is this interrelationship between nuclear weapons and the climate crisis, because nuclear weapons would affect global climate. And climate change can also impact nuclear weapons in terms of sea level rise, extreme climate events, forest fires, etc. We have seen cases where even American nuclear installations, bases have to be relocated because of climate change. And finally, there is a legitimate mobilization to act about the impact of climate change. So there should be also similar or parallel negotiation and mobilization against the impact of nuclear weapons. Of course, you can read a lot, and I encourage you to read and take part in this mobilization. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for the technical glitches.
Thank you, Marc, for your very thorough presentation. I think we all learned a lot of what you just said. So now we have some time for an open discussion. We won't make it too long, I promise. So you can send your questions in the chat, and I will firstly give the floor to Nino, who is in a room with some Sciences Po students. Nino?
So I think one question we had on our side was, in general, like, what is the time frame for these negative impacts of nuclear testing or nuclear weapons to kind of disappear from the environment, or is this something that is just consistent and like the effects will become multiplied for continued testing, I guess?
Marc, do you want to take that, or should I give it a shot, and then you can follow up with anything further? So there are different timescales that would be involved with different kinds of isotopes. If you're talking about something like plutonium, which I didn't talk about, you're really talking about that many thousands of years, depending on which isotope of plutonium we're talking about. The two isotopes that I was discussing, so both cesium-137 and strontium-90 have a half-life of about 30 years. What that means is on the order of 5, 6, 7, however you want to count, 150 to 200 years, they should mostly be gone from the environment. So, we're not talking about immediate, right? It doesn't go away right away. There's some environmental impacts, especially with with something like an atoll, the ocean washing things off and so on. That's of course bad news for the ocean, but the range, the timescales can really range. And one of if we go back to thinking about how the testing impacted the local populations, one of the really most impactful isotopes was iodine-131, which has a half-life of 8 days. So it's essentially gone within weeks. But when someone is exposed to it right, during the testing, or in our worst, nightmare scenario during an actual explosion, then iodine collects in the actually in the thyroid and has been linked heavily to thyroid cancer. So those are just, so again, you can go from days, weeks to thousands of years in terms of timescales.
Thank you, Ivana. I have received another question. Maybe both Jean-Marie and Ivana can answer this one. So it is about victim compensation. It's Barbara Warren asking, have the victim of exposure been compensated for the cancers they may have developed, as we do in the US for the Nevada test site exposure from above ground test? So you can maybe both answer for both Algeria and the Marshall Islands.
Okay, I will begin with about Algeria and Polynesia. Because the law, the Morin law is for both populations. So it's for the Algerians, the French, and the Polynesians, or participate or were there on this zone where the French nuclear test happens. And there is a huge difference between Algeria and Polynesia. When the law was passed in 2010, they just consider on some exact locations for Algeria, which is still the case, and some exact locations for Polynesia. But then with the civil society action in Polynesia, there were obligations and with some revelations about some huge contaminations on all the territory of Polynesia, there were an obligation to include all the Polynesian territory. So to have the right to pretend to a compensation, you have to be there at this moment, so between 1960 to 1996 in Algeria or in Polynesia, to show documents that exactly show that, to have one of the 23 diseases that are actually listed. And then after that, there is a studying about your case. And what we know is that, so since 2010, we have probably less than 2,000 cases that they were proposed, and less than 500 were accepted as they were victim. But we have a huge difference on these 500 cases. There is just one Algerian case actually who received compensations. And that's a huge and real problem. And one of the main problems is that the population is not aware about their possibility to pretend for something. Two, obviously, the people who live in Algeria at this period, and even some Polynesians, didn't have any documents to show that they live like a contract, like a proof that you have a house or stuff like that. Also, you have all these populations who are Tuareg, so they move inside the desert because it's their cultures. So that's extremely complicated. And the last point is that all the documents actually are only in French. And even if in Algeria you speak French or you can read French, they speak Arabic. So since, for example, a few years now, they decide to translate in Polynesian language the law to help the populations to understand what they can pretend. So for the moment, the numbers of cases who receive the title as victim is extremely low. In the coming days, because there was like an different jurisdictional process, and the law is a bit complicated. But in the coming days, we think we are going to open the case to a transgenerational victims, which we will have for the first time, a mom and her daughter who is recognized as a victim. So we really begin this case. We try to push to obtain some health studies, because we need to have some health studies, because that's the proof of the existence of this transgenerational case, because obviously it exists in Japan, for example. So there is no reason, I would say, that it doesn't exist in Polynesia or in Algeria. So this is where we are actually.
If it's okay, I think Mr. Pelopidas would also like to make a quick comment.
Yeah, I just want to expand on what Jean-Marie just said on victim compensation and essentially the evolution of scholarship on that issue, and point those who are interested to, in particular, two studies on Polynesia. One is a book and a companion site, which is called the Mororo Files, which you can find in French and in English, based on 2,000 pages of primary sources and simulation of the trajectory of the clouds following particular tests, French tests in Polynesia, which allowed independent researchers Sébastien Philippe and Thomas Statius to restate how much contamination actually happened. So the book is available in French and called Toxique, published with PUF last year, available in English very soon. The primary sources are available on the website already, and there is a video with the simulation in the trajectory of the clouds. In Algeria, a fabulous, and I mean fabulous, PhD dissertation, which was just defended 2 weeks ago at the University of Pennsylvania by Austin Cooper, who looked at IAEA, UN, French, Moroccan, British, and American archives on how measurements were made of French nuclear testing in Algeria. So for those of you who are interested in, how knowledge production advances about this, this is the latest that at least I'm aware of, and I can point you to.
Mathilde, if I can just add a little tiny bit on the Marshall Islands. So for the case of the Marshall Islands, there was a nuclear claims tribunal that was set up to compensate the victims. And while that tribunal was initially funded by Congress, it was not funded to cover the entirety of all of the costs and burdens that had been submitted by the victims. So the United States put in something like $150 million. And, when it comes to, again, I think it's a point that I made, but I'll stress it again. When it comes to the impacts, it goes so much further than just, did you get cancer? Did you not get cancer? Did you have a miscarriage? Did you not have a miscarriage? Was your child born with a birth defect? Was your child not born with a birth defect? Of course, these impacts were so much deeper than that. And one of the things that's often said is for things like even something like cleaning up bikini, which from our work on the environmental impacts, it's probably the most robust conclusion for us was always that bikini is just too contaminated for people to live there. It must be cleaned, must be returned to the Marshallese people in the state that it was taken away from them. And the claim is always, it's too expensive. And what that claim doesn't take into account is how much power, economic, global, however you want to think about it, the nuclear weapon states gained from showing that they had these weapons, that they could test them, that they could, be the big shots, right, in the world. And to me, any kind of both compensation for the victims and remediation efforts is just a drop in the bucket of what they actually gained from hurting these populations. So that's just, yeah.
I mean, just add that there is also a sort of intentional or semi-intentional strategy of just gaining time, buying time, because the longer we wait, the less victims there will be alive, and then need compensation. Just to recall that only last year, a Japanese court agreed to give compensation to the victims of the so-called black rains that were the result of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but these people didn't live in the cities. They were just, kilometers away, but they suffered from this black rain with radioactive dust. And it took so many years, to recognize that this was a direct consequence of the explosion. And so the same happened in Kazakhstan. Of course, Kazakhstan, is one of the countries with the largest number of people, victims and contaminated by Soviet nuclear test. But if you look at the statistics about the people who are really compensated, they speak about 1 million victims, but they only compensate a few thousand.
Thank you, Marc. I think this is all the time we have for today. I want to thank every one of you for staying with us today. Thank you to the speakers for agreeing to, intervene and take time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I think it has really been an enlightening discussion. Before we all go, if you could all quickly turn your cameras on, we would like to have a little picture. That would be great. Can I be on spot? Wait, I can. Yes, so we can. Okay. Is everybody ready? Yeah, I'll wait for a second. Awesome. Okay, everybody's coming on. That's amazing. Thank you. Okay, so everybody smile. Perfect. It's taken. Thank you so much, everybody. Again, I hope you enjoyed today. Don't hesitate to follow us on social media to know everything about our upcoming events. Again, thank you to all the speakers. It was really lovely having you all here. Thank you. Have a nice night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Excellent discussion. Thank you.
Yeah,
very
excellent
much,
discussion
everyone.
and a very complimentary presentation. So great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope to see
everyone.
all you soon.
Yes.
Bye-bye.